The chamber was the largest room John Morrison had ever seen in his life, and he had seen some big barns back in Kansas. But this was something else entirely. The walls rose up so high that he could not see where they ended, and they were made of some kind of crystal that glowed with soft blue light, and the floor beneath his feet was smooth and cold, and it made him feel very small, which he figured was probably the 12 platforms floated in a circle around him, and on each platform sat a being that looked nothing like anything he had ever imagined, and some of them had too many eyes, and some of them had no eyes at all, and one of them appeared to be made entirely of light, and another one looked like a giant insect wrapped in armor that sparkled like diamonds. John stood in the center of it all, wearing his cleanest pair of jeans and a button-down shirt that his wife, Sarah, had ironed for him that morning, and he held his hands at his sides and tried not to fidget. The giant insect creature spoke first, and its voice came through the small device in John's ear, translated into English that sounded flat and mechanical. Subject identification confirmed as John Morrison of the planet designated Earth in the outer spiral arm of this galaxy, and this assessment hearing is now in session. John nodded because he did not know what else to do. You have been selected as a representative sample of your species for evaluation purposes, and the Council will now determine the significance rating of humanity based on standard metrics. A hologram appeared in the air next to John, and it showed his entire life, laid out like a map, and there was his birth in the small hospital in Topeka, and there was his childhood on the farm, and there was his time in the army, and there was his marriage to a farm, and there was his marriage to Sarah, and there was every single day he had spent fixing tractors and combines and irrigation systems. Subject age is 34 Earth years, which translates to approximately 1/3 of maximum human lifespan, and this is noted as extremely brief by galactic standards. The light creature on one of the platforms made a sound that the translator rendered as laughter. Subject has no detectable psionic capability and no natural biological defenses, and no ability to survive in vacuum or extreme temperatures, and no redundant organ systems. Another hologram appeared showing a human body next to what appeared to be the insect creature's body, and the comparison was not flattering, and the insect had 4 hearts and could regenerate lost limbs and could survive without oxygen for days. Subject occupation is listed as agricultural equipment mechanic, which indicates a focus on primitive mechanical systems rather than advanced technology. John cleared his throat, and the sound echoed in the massive chamber. Excuse me, but those primitive mechanical systems feed about 300 families in my county, and I am pretty good at what I do. The chamber went silent for a moment, and then the insect creature, which John had figured out was called High Arbiter Velcrix, made a gesture with one of its many arms. The subject's statement is noted, but does not alter the assessment criteria, and we will now proceed to the vote. One by one, each of the 12 beings on the platforms cast their vote, and each vote was the same, and John did not need the translator to understand what they were saying. Tier 9 classification is unanimous, and the subject species is hereby designated as insignificant with no threat potential and no strategic value and no requirement for further observation or contact. Velcrix looked down at John, and there might have been something like pity in those compound eyes, but it was hard to tell. You may return to your planet, John Morrison, and live out your brief existence in peace, and the Council thanks you for your cooperation in this assessment. John stood there for a long moment, and he thought about all the things he could say, and he thought about arguing, and he thought about demanding respect. And he thought about the speeches he had seen in movies where the underdog stands up and proves everyone wrong with words alone. But John Morrison was not a man who put much stock in speeches. Can I ask one question before I go? Velcrix tilted its massive head. You may ask, what happens to the species you decide are significant? The chamber went quiet again, and this time it was a different kind of quiet. Significant. Species are monitored and regulated and integrated into council systems for the benefit of galactic stability. John nodded slowly. So you watch them and you control them and you make sure they do what you want. We guide them toward optimal outcomes. For all, and the insignificant ones, they are left alone to develop or decline as their nature dictates, and they are not our concern. John Morrison smiled, and it was a small smile, and it did not reach his eyes. Thank you for explaining that, and I think I understand now, and I would like to go home, please. Velcrick seemed surprised by the response, or maybe confused, and it was hard to read emotions on a face that was not human. You accept the council's judgment. I heard it, and now I would like to go home to my wife and my farm and my insignificant life. The council exchanged looks, or what passed for looks among beings with such different anatomies, and then Velcrick waved one of its arms. You are dismissed, John Morrison, and a transport will return you to your planet. John walked out of the chamber and down the long crystalline corridor and into the small ship that had brought him here, and he sat in silence as it carried him across the stars. Back to Earth, the whole trip took about 3 hours, which still amazed him because 3 hours ago he had been a mechanic, and now he was a mechanic who had been judged worthless by beings who ruled the galaxy. Sarah was waiting for him when the ship landed in the field behind their farmhouse, and she ran to him and held him tight and asked him what happened. They said, we do not matter, and they said, I am insignificant, and they said humanity is not worth watching. Sarah pulled back and looked at his face, and she knew him well enough to see what was burning behind his eyes. What are you going to do about it? John Morrison looked up at the sky, where the stars were just starting to appear in the darkening blue, and he thought about all those beings on their floating platforms looking down at him like he was nothing. I'm going to prove them wrong, but not by talking, and not by asking permission, and not by playing their game. He took his wife's hand, and they walked toward the house. They gave us the greatest gift they could have given us, Sarah, and they do not even know it. What gift? They told everyone in the galaxy that we are not worth watching, and that means nobody is going to be watching when we get to work. That night, John Morrison sat on his porch and looked at the stars, and he began to make a list in his head, and the list had names on it, and the names belonged to people he knew and people he had heard about and people who had been told their whole lives that they were not good enough. He was going to find them, and he was going to ask them a simple question. What would you build if nobody was watching? The answer to that question would change everything. 3 years is not a long time when you are measuring the life of a star or the history of a civilization, but 3 years is enough time for a stubborn man with a plan to change everything. John Morrison started small because that was the only way to start, and he began with a single phone call to a woman named Maria Chun, who had worked for NASA until the council's arrival had made most of her work irrelevant. Maria had spent 20 years studying rocket propulsion, and then one day, the villain day, aliens showed up with engines that made her life's work look like a child's toy, and she had been dismissed from her job and told that her skills were no longer needed, and she had been sitting in her apartment in Houston, drinking coffee and wondering what to do with the rest of her life when her phone rang. My name is John Morrison, and I am a tractor mechanic from Kansas, and I was wondering if you would like to help me build a spaceship. Maria Chun laughed for the first time in 6 months. You are joking. I am not joking, and I have a barn, and I have tools, and I have time, and I have been told that I am insignificant, and I am betting you have been told something similar. Maria did not say anything for a long moment. How did you get my name? I asked around, and I made some calls, and I found people who knew people, and your name kept coming up as someone who was brilliant and angry and had nothing left to lose. That is not exactly a compliment. It was meant as one, and the question is whether you want to spend the rest of your life being angry or whether you want to do something about it. Maria Chun arrived in Kansas 3 days later, and she brought with her 2 suitcases full of notes and calculations and dreams that she had been told would never come true. She was the first, but she was not the last. David Okonkwo came next, and he was a geneticist from Nigeria who had been working on agricultural improvements when the council declared that human biology was too primitive to be worth studying, and his funding had disappeared overnight, and his research had been shelved, and he had been teaching high school biology when John found him. Then came Elena Vasquez, who had been an aerospace engineer in Mexico, and then came Yuki Tanaka, who had been a materials scientist in Japan, and then came 40 more, and then 100 more, and then 200 more. They came from every country and every background, and they had one thing in common, and that was the knowledge that they had been declared worthless by beings who had never bothered to understand what humans could do. The barn grew over those 3 years, and it started as just a barn, but it became a workshop and then a laboratory and then a factory, and the neighbors learned not to ask questions when strange lights appeared at night and strange sounds came from behind the big wooden doors. John Morrison did not pretend to be the smartest person in the room because he knew he was not, and Maria Chun could do calculations in her head that made his brain hurt, and David Okonkwo understood things about biology that sounded like magic, and Elena Vasquez could look at a piece of metal and tell you exactly how it would behave under stress. But John Morrison could do something that none of them could do alone, and he could make broken things work. The council uses psionic amplifiers in their engines, Maria said one night when they were sitting around a table covered with blueprints and coffee cups. And that is why they think our technology is primitive, because we cannot do what they do with their minds. So we do it another way, John said. It is not that simple. Why not? Maria opened her mouth to explain, and then she stopped, and she looked at John, and she started to laugh again. You know what? And you are right, and it is exactly that simple. And we just have to figure out how. They figured out how. It took 18 months, and a lot of failed experiments, and one fire that almost burned down the barn, and another fire that actually did burn down part of the barn. But they figured out how the engine that Maria Chun designed did not use psionic amplification because humans could not do that, and instead it used thermodynamics and mechanical principles and good old-fashioned engineering, and it was not elegant, and it was not pretty, but it worked. David Okonkwo created a neural interface that let humans control the ship without telepathy, and it plugged directly into the human nervous system, and it used electrical impulses instead of psychic energy, and it gave the pilot headaches for the first week. But after that, it worked perfectly. Elena Vasquez designed a hull that could take a beating and keep flying, and it was not graceful like council ships, and it looked like someone had welded armor plates onto a freight container, but it could survive things that would tear a council ship apart. And John Morrison did what he always did, and he took all the pieces that other people had created and he made them work together, and he fixed the problems that nobody else could see, and he held the whole thing together with determination and duct tape and stubbornness. The ship sat in the barn when it was finished, and it was ugly, and it was rough, and it looked like nothing the galaxy had ever seen before. What do we call it? Maria asked John. Looked at the ship that 200 humans had built in secret over 3 years, and he thought about what it represented. And he thought about the old mules that his grandfather had used on the farm, back before tractors, and those mules had been stubborn and tough, and they never gave up no matter how hard the work. We call it the mule. Maria nodded. That fits. The night before the first test flight, John gathered everyone together in the barn, and he stood in front of them, and he looked at their faces, and he saw engineers and scientists and farmers and teachers and mechanics, and he saw 200 people who had been told they did not matter. 3 years ago, I stood in front of the Galactic Council, and they told me that I was insignificant, and they told me that humanity had no value, and they told me that we were not worth watching. He paused and looked At the ship behind him. They were wrong about us, and this ship proves it, and we built something that they said was impossible, and we did it without their help, and without their permission, and without their knowledge. He smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes. Tomorrow we are going to fly, and tomorrow we are going to show the galaxy what insignificant people can do when they work together, and tomorrow everything changes. The barn was silent for a moment, and then someone started clapping, and then everyone was clapping, and the sound echoed off the walls and filled the space with hope. The mule flew the next morning, just before dawn, and it rose up from the Kansas field, and it broke through the atmosphere, and it kept going. And it worked. It was not pretty, but it worked, and somewhere far away, a monitoring satellite sent its regular report to the Galactic Council, and the report said what it always said: no significant activity detected. The satellite was not looking for barns. The distress signal came from a small planet on the edge of known space, and it was a simple message repeated over and over in a language that the translation software could barely understand. Help us, and we are dying, and please help us. John Morrison was eating breakfast when Maria Chun burst into the kitchen with a tablet in her hands, and her face was pale and her hands were shaking. We intercepted a signal, and it is from a Drethary colony, and they are being attacked by something called harvesters. John put down his coffee cup. What are harvesters? Machine intelligence, and they consume resources, and they do not negotiate, and they do not stop, and the Council has known about them for centuries. What is the Council doing about it? Maria's expression told him the answer before she spoke. Nothing, and the colony is not strategically significant, and resources cannot be allocated, and they sent their condolences. John stood up from the table, and he walked to the window, and he looked out at the barn, where the mule sat waiting, and he thought about what it would mean to do what he was thinking about doing. How far away is this colony? 11 hours at maximum speed. How many harvesters are attacking? We do not know exactly, but the signal mentioned dozens of ships. How many people are on that colony? About 3,000, including children. John turned away from the window. Did everyone together, and I mean everyone who wants to come and tell them what we are doing, and tell them it is dangerous, and tell them we might not come back, and then tell them we are leaving in 1 hour. Maria stared at him. John, we have one ship, and we have never been in a real fight, and we do not know what we are doing. Neither do they, and 3,000 people are going to die if nobody helps them, and the Council says they are not worth saving. And I say the Council is wrong. Maria nodded slowly. 1 hour. 47 people volunteered to crew the mule that day, and they were not soldiers, and they were not warriors, and they were engineers and farmers and teachers and mechanics, and they were scared, and they went anyways. The journey took 11 hours, and during those hours, John walked through the ship and talked to every single person on board. And he did not give speeches about glory or duty or honor, and instead he told them the truth. I do not know if we can win, and I do not know if we will survive, and I do not know what is going to happen when we get there. And the only thing I know for certain is that 3,000 people need help, and we are the only ones coming. An old woman named Sun Hee Park, who had been a computer programmer in Seoul before the Council arrived, looked at John with steady eyes. That is enough, and that is why we are here. The mule dropped out of faster than light, travel above the Drethary colony, and the planet below was burning, and dozens of black ships hung in orbit, and they were angular and mechanical, and they looked like they had been designed by something that did not understand beauty or mercy. The harvesters turned their attention to the mole immediately, and the translation software picked up their communication, and it was cold and logical and terrifying. Unknown vessel identified, and composition analyzed, and threat level calculated as minimal, and vessel will be processed for resources. John sat in the captain's chair, which was really just an old tractor seat bolted to the floor, and he looked at the screen showing the enemy ships, and he smiled. They think we are minimal threat and good, and let us show them what minimal threat looks like. The battle that followed was not like anything in the history of galactic warfare, and was not elegant, and it was not organized. And it was chaos and improvisation and pure human stubbornness. Maria Chun flew the mule like she was trying to break every law of physics, and the ship twisted and turned and dove between the harvester vessels, and the machines could not predict her movements, because their algorithms were not designed for pilots who flew on instinct and anger. David Okonkwo had modified the ship's sensors to detect the electromagnetic signatures of the harvester control systems, and he called out targets. While hanging onto a console with one hand and typing with the other, Park hacked into the harvester communication network using techniques she had developed back when she was breaking copy protection on video games, and she could not shut them down, but she could confuse them, and she flooded their systems with garbage data that made them hesitate for just a moment, and sometimes a moment was enough, and John Morrison put on a spacesuit and grabbed a bag full of magnetic mines that he had built in his barn back in Kansas, and he went outside. The harvesters had never encountered a species that would do something so illogical, and their tactical algorithms had no response for a man in a spacesuit welding explosives to their hulls while his ship drew fire all around him. John planted 7 mines on the first harvester ship before they even registered him as a threat, and when those mines exploded, the ship broke apart, and John was already moving to the next one. The battle lasted 6 hours, and it was brutal, and it was terrifying, and it was glorious. The mule took damage that should have destroyed it 3 times over, but Elena Vasquez had built it to take a beating, and it kept flying, and the engines that Maria Chun had designed kept burning, and the hull held together through pure stubbornness and prayer. When it was over, 23 harvester ships drifted dead in space, and the rest had fled, and the Drethery colony was still there, and 3,000 people were still alive. John Morrison floated in space outside the last harvester wreck, and he looked at the planet below, and he saw lights turning on in cities that had been dark, and he knew that he had done something that mattered. The mole's radio crackled with a new signal, and it was the Drethery speaking, and their voices were filled with something that needed no translation. Unknown vessel and unknown people. And we do not know who you are, and we do not know why you came, and we only know that you saved us, and we will never forget. John keyed his radio. My name is John Morrison, and I am a mechanic from a planet called Earth, and the Galactic Council told us that we are insignificant, and we came because you needed help, and that is all. There was silence, and then the Drethery voice spoke again. The council told us that no one would come, and the council told us that we were not worth saving. The council was wrong, and you are worth saving, and so is everyone else. The mule limped home with a crew of 47 exhausted humans and a ship held together with emergency patches and hope. And when they landed in the field behind John's farm, they discovered that the world had changed. The Galactic Council had received reports of the battle, and they had demanded to know who had authorized human involvement in a sovereign conflict. And they had sent an official protest to Earth's puppet government, and they had demanded answers. John Morrison sent back one message, and it was short. And it was clear. We did not need authorization, and we needed to help, and that is what humans do. The council did not know how to respond to that, and for the first time in 3,000 years, they had encountered something they could not classify. In barns and warehouses and basements all over Earth, other humans watched what had happened, and they began to build their own ships. The movement had begun. 4 years had passed since a mechanic from Kansas had stood alone in the council chamber, and 4 years had changed everything and nothing. The chamber looked exactly the same, with its crystal walls and floating platforms and 12 ancient beings sitting in judgment. But John Morrison was not the same man who had stood here before, and this time he did not come alone. Behind him in the space above the council world hung 43 ships, and they were not elegant, and they were not beautiful, and they looked like they had been built by people who cared more about function than form, because they had been the Barn Fleet, they called it, and the name had started as a joke, but it had stuck because it was true, and every single one of those ships had been built in secret by humans who had been told they did not matter. John walked across the crystalline floor, and his boots echoed in the vast space, and he was older, now with gray in his hair and new scars on his hands from battles and repairs and long nights of work that never seemed to end. High Arbiter Valkyries looked down at him from the same platform, and the bioluminescence that had once sparkled with authority now seemed dimmer, somehow as if the weight of recent events had taken something from the ancient being. John Morrison of Earth, you have been summoned to answer for crimes against galactic law, and you have interfered in 17 sovereign conflicts without authorization, and you have violated the terms of humanity's classification, and you have disrupted the natural order that has maintained peace for 3,000 years. John stood in the center of the room, and he did not flinch, and he did not look away. I heard all of that, and now I have a question. You do not have the right to question this council. I'm going to ask anyway, and my question is this, and what exactly do you plan to do about it? The chamber erupted in sounds that the translator could not fully convey, and there was anger and outrage, and something that might have been fear. Valkyries raised one of its many arms, and the chamber went silent. You threatened the council. No. And I am asking a practical question, and 4 years ago, you told me that humanity was insignificant. And you told me that we had no value, and no threat potential, and no reason to be observed. And you told the entire galaxy that we did not matter. John spread his hands. So what are you going to do now, and are you going to change that classification and admit that you were wrong, or are you going to try to enforce it and pretend that we are still beneath your notice? He smiled, and it was not a kind expression, because I have to tell you that either way works for us, and if we matter, then you have to treat us as equals and negotiate with us and listen to what we have to say, and if we do not matter, then we are free to do whatever we want, and you have no authority over us, and you cannot have it both ways. The being made of light on one of the platforms spoke for the first time, and its voice was like music played on instruments that should not exist. This is sophistry and wordplay, and it does not change the fundamental reality of power. You are right, and it does not change the reality of power, and the reality of power is that 43 ships are floating above your world right now, and those ships have crews who have already proven that they will fight for people the council has abandoned, and those crews are not afraid of you. John turned in a slow circle, looking at each of the 12 beings on their platforms. We did not come here to threaten you, and we did not come here to fight you, and we came here because 17 species sent representatives to ask us to speak on their behalf. He gestured, and the doors of the chamber opened, and beings began to enter, and they were not human. The Drathiri came first, and they were tall and slender with skin that shifted colors like oil on water, and their ambassador walked to stand beside John Morrison. The humans saved our colony when the council abandoned us, and 3,000 of our people are alive because of them, and we stand with humanity. Then came the Keth, and they were short and stocky and covered in thick fur, and their representative spoke in a rumbling voice. Pirates attacked our mining outpost, and the council said we were not strategically important, and the humans came in a ship held together with adhesive tape, and they drove the pirates away, and we stand with humanity. One by one, 17 species entered the chamber, and one by one they stood beside the mechanic from Kansas, and each one told a story of abandonment by the council and salvation by humans who had never asked for anything in return. When the last of them had spoken, John Morrison turned back to face Valkyries. You want to know what we plan to do, and the answer is that we plan to keep helping people who need help, and we plan to keep showing up when no one else will, and we plan to keep proving that significance is not something you can assign with a vote. Velcrix stared down at the human and at the 17 species standing with him, and at the fleet waiting above the planet and the ancient arbiter. Was silent for a long time. What do you want, John Morrison? I want you to understand something, and I want you to really understand it, and not just hear the words. John took a breath. You measured us by the wrong standards, and you looked at our biology, and our technology, and our lifespans, and you decided that we were primitive and worthless, and you never thought to measure the things that actually matter. He pointed at the beings standing beside him. These species are here because we helped them. And we helped them because they needed help, and that was the only reason. And we did not ask what they could do for us, and we did not calculate their strategic value, and we did not check their classification before we decided they were worth saving. His voice was steady and certain. That is what humans do, and that is what we have always done, and that is what makes us significant. And you can classify us however you want, and you can write whatever you want in your records, but you cannot change what we are. The chamber was silent. Velcrix looked at the fractured council and at the divided species, and at the impossible human standing in the center of it all, and the arbiter finally understood what had happened. The council had not been defeated by military force or political maneuvering or technological superiority, and the council had been defeated by an idea, and the idea was simple, and the idea was that everyone mattered and that you did not need permission to do the right thing. The council will deliberate, Velcrix said finally. John nodded. Take your time, and we will be here, and we are not going anywhere, and neither is anyone else who has decided that they matter. He turned and walked toward the door, and the 17 species walked with him, and behind them the council sat in silence, trying to understand how a species they had dismissed as worthless had changed everything without firing a single shot in anger. The Barn fleet was still waiting when they emerged, and John looked up at those ugly, beautiful ships, and he smiled. What happens now? The Drethari ambassador asked. Now we go back to work, and there are still people who need help, and there are still species being abandoned, and there is still a galaxy that needs to learn that significance is not assigned by councils. John Morrison looked at the stars. We have a lot of work to do. 20 years had passed since the day John Morrison first stood before the Galactic Council, and the galaxy was not the same place it had been, and neither was John Morrison. He was an old man now, with white hair and hands that shook sometimes, and knees that ached when the weather changed, and he had retired to his farm in Kansas 5 years ago, and he spent most of his days sitting on the porch watching the sky. Barn was a museum now, and beings came from across the galaxy to see where it had all started, and they walked through the space where the mule had been built, and they looked at the tools and the blueprints and the old coffee cups that had been preserved behind glass, and they tried to understand how everything had changed. In this one small place, John did not much like the attention, but he tolerated it because he understood that people needed to see, and they needed to believe that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, and if his old barn helped them believe that, then he would let them come. And look, Sarah had passed away 3 years ago, and John still talked to her sometimes when he sat on the porch in the evening, and he told her about the visitors, and about the news from the fleet, and about the grandchildren who were growing up in a galaxy that was so different from the one they had been born into. The Galactic Council still existed, but it was not the same institution that had dismissed humanity all those years ago, and it had been forced to change, because the alternative was to become irrelevant, and more species had started to follow the human example, and they had started to help each other without asking permission, and they had started to decide for themselves what mattered. The Barn fleet had grown into something larger, and it was not a military, and it was not a government, and it was something new and something that had never existed before, and it was a network of people from dozens of species who showed up when others needed help, and who asked nothing in return except that you pass it on. John had given up trying to lead it years ago, because it had grown too big for any one person to lead, and that was probably for the best, and the fleet did not need a leader. And it needed people who were willing to work, and there were always more of those. A ship landed in the field behind the farmhouse one afternoon, and John watched it come down, and he did not get up from his chair because his knees hurt and because he had learned that whoever was coming would find their way to the porch. Eventually, the being who walked across the field was Drethry, and young by their standards, which meant she was probably only about 100 years old, and she had a recording device in her hands and the look of someone who had come a long way to ask questions. "Mr. Morrison, and my name is Kiravel, and I am a journalist, and I was hoping you might talk to me." John gestured at the empty chair beside him. "Sit down, and I do not move as fast as I used to, and you can ask your questions from there." Kira sat, and she looked at the old human, and she tried to reconcile the legend with the reality, and the reality was just an old man on a porch looking at the sky. "I want to understand how it happened, and I want to understand how one person changed the entire galaxy." John laughed, and it turned into a cough, and he took a moment to catch his breath. "I did not change anything, and that is the first thing you need to understand, and I was just the first one to say out loud what everyone else was already thinking." "What do you mean?" The council had been telling people for thousands of years that some species mattered, and some species did not, and they had been assigning value based on things like psionic ability and biological advantages and technological development, and they had convinced everyone that this was the natural order of things. He shook his head, but it was never true, and it was just a story they told, and people believed it because people believe the stories they are told, especially when those stories come from beings with power. Kira leaned forward. "So what did you do?" "I told a different story, and the story I told was simple, and the story was that everyone matters, and that you do not need permission to help people who need help, and that significance is not something that can be assigned by a council." That does not sound like enough to change a galaxy. It was not, and the story was not enough by itself, and what mattered was that people started to act like the story was true, and they started to build ships, and they started to help each other, and they started to prove that the old story was wrong. John looked at the sky where stars were beginning to appear in the darkening blue. "The council measured us by all the wrong things, and they looked at our bodies and our technology and our lifespans, and they decided we were worthless, and they never thought to measure the things that actually mattered." "What things?" "What we were willing to do for each other. And that is not a human thing, by the way, and that is a people thing, and every species has it. And the council just forgot how to see it." Kira was quiet for a moment. "Do you have any regrets?" John thought about the question, and he thought about Sarah, and he thought about all the people he had known who were gone now, and he thought about all the battles and all the long nights and all the times he had been afraid. "Only that I did not start sooner, and only that I wasted so many years believing the story they told about us, and only that it took being told. I was worthless to realize that I had always had worth." He turned to look at the young journalist. "That is the thing you should tell people. And do not wait for permission, and do not wait for someone to tell you that you matter, and decide for yourself what matters and then do something about it." Kira nodded, and she turned off her recording device, and she sat with the old man for a while longer, watching the stars come out. "What happens next?" she asked. Finally, John smiled, and it was the same smile he had worn all those years ago, when he first looked up at these same stars and decided to prove the council wrong. "That is up to you, and that has always been up to you, and I did my part, and now it is your turn, and the turn of everyone who comes after." He closed his eyes. "The galaxy is full of people who need help, and there are always more of them than there are people willing to help, and the math never works out, and you can never save everyone." That sounds hopeless. No. And that sounds like a reason to keep trying. And that is the secret. And that is the only secret there ever was. And you keep trying not because you will win, but because trying is what matters, and because every person you help is proof that the old story was wrong. Kira stood up and she looked at the old man on the porch, and she understood something that she had not understood before. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Call me John, and now go and find someone who needs help and do not ask permission. Kira walked back to her ship, and John watched her go, and he sat on his porch. As the night grew dark and the stars filled the sky, somewhere out there, the fleet was still flying, and somewhere out there, people were still helping each other, and somewhere out there, the story he had told was still being proven true. John Morrison closed his eyes and smiled. It had been a good life, and it had been a meaningful life, and it had started right here on this porch when an old man had looked at the stars and decided that he would not accept what they told him he was. The galaxy was different now, and it would keep changing, and it would keep growing, and it would keep finding new ways to prove that everyone mattered. That was enough. That had always been enough. On the memorial they would build for him years later, they would carve words that he had never actually said, but that captured what he had meant. Significance is not granted by councils or given by classifications, and it is earned in the choices we make when no one is watching, and proven in the hands we extend when no one else will. The stars kept shining and the galaxy kept turning, and somewhere a ship was flying towards someone who needed help. The story continued. It always would.